So, I have a ways to go in this book. Oh, a long ways, you can tell. Like, there's the pieces that I've read because the book is torn to shreds and, like, stained. And then there's the book that I haven't read yet, which is still rather pristine. This is what I'll tell you about this book, which my daughter got me this book. This book is really gritty and very, very descriptive. I have no idea. Oh, I spilled tea right there. That's hot tea. Anyway, I'm a little hoarse. Like, a little hoarse as in, I should probably drink some tea. Doesn't that sound good? We're gonna drink some tea for a second. Before we start reading. I worked on writing my book today, so that was cool. I'm actually getting a lot done all the way around today. It feels very productive, and I'm grateful. Chapter 7, 10:16 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, New York City. Blue light was spinning. Cold rain came down, and a young man in a yellow rain slicker reached out his arms. "Give her to me, lady," he said. His voice as hollow as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. "Come on, let me have her." "No," Sister Creep shouted, and the man's face fragmented into pieces like the shattering of a mirror. He thrust out her hands to push it away, but then she was sitting up and the nightmare was whirling away in pieces like silver bats. The sound of her cry echoed back and forth between the walls of rough gray brick, and she sat staring at nothing for a moment as the sputtering of nerves shook her body. "Oh," she thought, when her head cleared. "That was a bad one." She touched her clammy forehead and her fingers came away damp. That was close, she thought. The young demon in the yellow raincoat was there again, very near, and he almost got my... Got my what? The thought was gone now, whatever it had been. It had flipped over in the dark side of her memory. She often dreamed of the demon in the yellow raincoat, and was always wanting her to give him something. In the dream, a blue light was always flashing, hurting her eyes, and rain was hitting her in the face. Sometimes the surroundings seemed terribly familiar, and sometimes she almost knew what he wanted. But she knew he was a demon, or probably the devil himself, trying to pull her away from Jesus, because her head pounded so badly after the dream was over. She didn't know what time it was, or whether it was day or night, but her stomach was rumbling with hunger. She had tried to sleep on a subway bench, but the noise of some shouting kids scared her, so she had trundled off with her bag in search of a more secure place. She found it at the bottom of a ladder that descended into a darkened section of subway tunnel. About 30 feet beneath the main tunnel was a drainage pipe, large enough for her to move through it if she stooped over. Dirty water streamed past her sneakers, and the tunnel was illuminated by an occasional blue utility lamp that showed the network of cables and pipes just overhead. The tunnel shook with the thunder of a subway train passing, and Sister Creep realized she was under the rails. But as she continued along the tunnel of noise, the trains faded to a polite, distant growl. She soon found evidence that this was a popular place for members of the Ragtag Nation. A beat-up old mattress pushed back into a cubbyhole, a couple of empty wine bottles, and human-dried excrement. She didn't mind. She'd seen worse. And so she'd slept on the mattress until the nightmare of the demon in the yellow raincoat had awakened her. She was hungry. And she decided she'd climb back up to the subway station to search for scraps in the garbage cans, but maybe try to find a newspaper, too, to see if Jesus had come while she was sleeping. Sister Creep stood up, put the strap of the bag around her shoulder, and left the cubbyhole. She started back along the tunnel, tinged by the dim blue glow of the utility bulbs, and hoped she'd find a hot dog today. She'd always been fond of hot dogs, with plenty of good spicy muss. The tunnel suddenly trembled. She heard the sound of concrete crackling. The blue lamps flickered, went dark, and then brightened again. There was a noise, like the howl of the wind or a runaway subway train speeding overhead. The blue lamps continued to brighten until the light was almost blinding, and Sister Creep squinted into the glare. She took 3 more uncertain steps forward. The utility bulbs began to explode. She put her hands up to shield her face. Pieces of glass began to strike her arms, and she thought with sudden clarity, "I'll sue somebody for this." In the next instant, the entire tunnel whipped violently to one side, and Sister Creep fell into the stream of dirty water. Chunks of concrete and rock dust cascaded from the ceiling. The tunnel whipped back in the direction with a force that made Sister Creep think that her insides were tearing loose, and concrete chunks hit her in the head and shoulders as her nostrils filled with grit. "Lord Jesus," she shouted. "Oh, choke! Oh, Lord Jesus!" Sparks shot overhead as cables began to rip free. She smelled the wet heat of steam and heard a pounding noise like the footsteps of a behemoth treading above her head. As the tunnel pitched and swayed, Sister Creep clung to her bag, riding out the gut-twisting undulations, a scream staining behind her clenched teeth. A wave of heat passed over her, stealing her breath. "God help me," she shrieked in her mind as she struggled for air. She heard something pop and tasted blood streaming from her nose. "I can't breathe. Oh, sweet Jesus, I can't breathe." She gripped at her throat, opened her mouth, and heard her own strangled scream wail away from her through the shivering tunnel. Finally, her tortured lungs dragged in a breath of scorched air, and she laid curled up on her side in the darkness, her body racked with spasms and her brain shocked numb. The violent twisting motion of the tunnel had stopped. Sister Creep drifted in and out of consciousness, and through the haze came the distant roar of that runaway subway train again. Only now it was getting louder. "Get up," she told herself, "get up. It's Judgment Day. The Lord has come. He's come in his chariot to take the righteous up into the rapture." But a calmer, clearer voice spoke behind the dark side of her memory, and it said, "Bullshit. Something bad's happening up there." "Rapture, rapture, rapture," she thought, forcing the wicked voice away. She sat up, wiped blood from her nose, and drew in a steamy, stifling air. The noise of the runaway train was closer. Sister Creep realized that the water she was sitting in had gotten hot. She grasped her bag and slowly rose to her feet. Everything was dark. When Sister Creep felt the tunnel walls, her fingers found a crazy quilt of cracks and fissures. The roaring was much louder, and the air was heating up. The concrete against her fingers felt like city pavement in noon in August, ready to fry eggs sunny side up. Far away along the tunnel there was a flicker of orange light, like the headlamp on a speeding subway train. The tunnel had begun to tremble again. Sister Creep stared, her face tightening, as the orange light grew brighter, showing streaks of incandescent red and purple. She realized then what it was, and she moaned like a trapped animal. A blast of fire roared toward her along the tunnel, and she could already feel the rush of air being sucked into its vacuum. In less than a minute it was upon her. Sister Creep's trance snapped. She turned and fled, holding her bag close, her sneakers splashing through the streaming water. She leaped broken pipes and pushed aside fallen cables with the frenzy of the doomed. She looked back and saw the flames shooting out red tendrils and snap to the air like whips. The vacuum suction pulled at her, trying to draw her backwards into the fire, and when she screamed, the air sizzled in her nostrils and at the back of her throat. She could smell burning hair, felt her back and her arms rippling with blisters. In maybe 30 seconds she'd be joining her Lord and Master, and it astounded her that she wasn't ready and willing to go. With a startled cry of terror, she suddenly tripped and fell headlong to the floor. As she started to scramble up, she saw she tripped over a grate into which the steam was draining. Beneath the grate was only darkness. She looked on to the onrushing fire, and her eyebrows singed. Her face broke into oozing blisters. The air was unbreathable. There was no time to get up and run. The fire was almost upon her. She gripped the bars of the grate and wrenched upward. One of the grate's rusted screws snapped, but the second held tight. The flames were less than 40 feet away, and Sister Creep's hair caught fire. "God help me," she screamed inwardly, and she pulled upward on the grate so hard she felt her shoulders almost rip loose from their sockets. The second screw snapped. Sister Creep flung the grate aside as the second had a second to grab her bag, then lunged headfirst into the hole. She fell about 4 feet into a coffin-sized space that held 8 inches of water. The flames passed overhead, sucking the air from her lungs and scorching every inch of her exposed skin. Her clothes burst into flames, and she rolled frantically in the water. For a few seconds there was nothing but roaring and the agony, and she smelled the odor of hot dogs being boiled in a vendor's cart. The wall of fire moved on like a comet, and in its wake returned a whoosh of outside air that carried the thick smell of charred flesh and molten metal. Down in the hole that fed drainage water to the sewer pipe, Sister Creep's body hitched and contorted. 3 inches of water had risen as mist and evaporated, blunting the full force of the fire. Her burned, tattered body struggled for breath, and finally gasped and sputtered, the blistered hands tightly gripping her smoldering canvas bag. And then she lay still.